What if the movies everyone laughed at in the 1990s were never actually failures? What if they just arrived too early, too strange, or too honest for their moment? These films didn't explode at the box office. They slipped, they vanished. And then something unexpected happened. Viewers found them anyway. On late-night TV, on dusty tapes, on the internet, years later. Halfway through this list, one title completely rewrote how audiences defined success. And the final entry? That one changed movie culture forever. Number 15. Showgirls, 1995. From the moment it arrived, Showgirls felt like a dare. A glossy studio release built on excess, confidence, and shock value, released into a mainstream audience that had no idea what to do with it. The marketing promised spectacle. What viewers got instead was something colder, stranger, and deeply uncomfortable. Critics tore it apart. Audiences stayed away. The box office collapse was immediate and spectacular. But time did something strange to Showgirls. Once the noise faded, viewers started noticing what was actually on screen. The performances were exaggerated on purpose. The tone wasn't subtle because it wasn't trying to be. This was a movie about ambition taken to absurd extremes, where every smile felt forced and every success came at a visible cost. What once looked like a mess began to feel intentional. The film found a second life through midnight screenings and home viewing, where people could approach it without studio expectations hanging overhead. Suddenly, it wasn't about realism. It was about satire. About how fame sells dreams and chews people up in the process. The exaggerated style stopped feeling accidental and started reading like commentary. Showgirls didn't change. The audience did. What was once labeled a disaster slowly transformed into a cult ritual. Quoted, rewatched, debated. It became proof that failure isn't always about quality. Sometimes it's about timing, and sometimes the loudest rejection is just the beginning of a very long afterlife. Number 14. Johnny Mnemonic, 1995. Johnny Mnemonic arrived carrying the future on its back and collapsed under the weight of expectations. Studios sold it as fast-paced digital spectacle. What audiences got was something more awkward, more theoretical, and far less friendly. The story moved at a strange rhythm. The ideas felt heavy, and the tone landed somewhere between comic book and warning sign. The box office response was brutal. Viewers weren't ready for a world obsessed with data, overloaded information, and people acting as storage devices for things they couldn't fully control. At the time, it felt abstract, confusing, too far removed from everyday life. Then the world caught up. Years later, Johnny Mnemonic feels less like fiction and more like an early sketch of where culture was heading. Endless information, short attention spans, tech promises that solve one problem while creating 10 more. Keanu Reeves plays the lead with a kind of confused exhaustion that suddenly makes perfect sense in hindsight. The movie's rough edges became part of its identity. The low-budget effects, the strange pacing, the earnest delivery of ideas that once seemed silly but now feel uncomfortably familiar. It found new fans online, where viewers approached it as a time capsule instead of a blockbuster. Johnny Mnemonic didn't fail because it was wrong. It failed because it showed up too early, and cult audiences love nothing more than a movie that knew something before everyone else did. Number 13. Office Space, 1999. Office Space didn't crash loudly. It simply arrived, confused people, and quietly disappeared. Studios didn't know how to market a comedy about boring jobs, quiet frustration, and the soul drain of routine work. There were no big punchlines, no traditional heroes, just cubicles, copy machines, and people slowly losing patience. The box office response reflected that confusion. Audiences shrugged. Critics were split. It looked like another comedy that missed its moment. Then the world changed. As work culture evolved, Office Space stopped feeling small and started feeling accurate. The jokes hit harder because they were rooted in recognition. The characters weren't exaggerated. They were familiar. That quiet anger, that forced politeness, that feeling of being replaceable. Viewers didn't laugh at the movie anymore. They laughed with it. Home video and cable turned Office Space into a shared language. Lines became shorthand for frustration. Scenes became memes before memes had a name. What once seemed low energy transformed into one of the sharpest workplace comedies ever made. The film didn't need spectacle. It needed time. Office Space proves that some movies don't want applause on opening weekend. They want endurance. And once it found its audience, it never let go. Number 12. Event Horizon, 1997. Event Horizon terrified the studio that released it, not because it was broken, but because it went too far for its era. Marketed as space adventure, it delivered something far darker, heavier, and more psychological. Audiences expecting thrills got dread instead. The reaction was swift. The box office dropped fast. For years, the film was dismissed as a miscalculation. Too intense, too unsettling, too different from what people wanted in the late 1990s. Then home viewing changed everything. Without marketing expectations, Event Horizon became a slow-burning favorite for viewers who appreciated atmosphere over comfort. The empty corridors, the distorted sound design, the feeling that space itself wasn't safe. Lawrence Fishburne's grounded performance gave the chaos weight, anchoring the story in quiet authority. The movie gained a reputation not through promotion, but through recommendation. People whispered about it, passed it along, revisited it late at night. Its reputation grew precisely because it never tried to please everyone. Event Horizon didn't become a cult classic despite its failure. It became one because of it. The film trusted its mood, and eventually the right audience showed up. Number 11. The Big Lebowski, 1998. When The Big Lebowski first hit theaters, audiences didn't know what they were watching. It wasn't a crime story. It wasn't a comedy in the traditional sense. It wandered, it digressed. It followed a man who seemed completely uninterested in progress. The box office reflected that confusion. The movie didn't land. Reviews were mixed. It looked like a minor entry in the filmmaker's career. Then something rare happened. Viewers started returning to it. Not for the plot, but for the feeling, the rhythm, the dialogue that sounded casual but stuck in your head. Jeff Bridges' performance as the Dude wasn't about change or growth. It was about presence, about drifting through chaos without letting it define you. The film became endlessly rewatchable. Each viewing revealed new jokes, new background moments, new layers of absurdity hiding behind relaxed delivery. Fans didn't just like it, they adopted it. The Big Lebowski grew into a full-blown cultural phenomenon without trying to be one. Quotes became rituals. Characters became icons. What once felt shapeless became timeless. It didn't bomb because it failed. It bombed because it refused to rush. And cult audiences understood that patience better than anyone. Number 10. No Escape, 1994. No Escape arrived with a big idea and almost no patience from audiences. It was sold as loud genre entertainment, but what it actually delivered was something heavier and more physical. The world felt harsh. The setting felt isolating. And the story refused to soften its edges. Viewers expecting easy thrills walked away, and the box office followed them out. Behind the scenes, the film became a cautionary tale. The studio spent nearly as much promoting it as making it. When the returns didn't match the gamble, the project was quietly abandoned. At the time, it looked like a textbook example of overconfidence, but stripped of marketing noise, No Escape holds up better than expected. Ray Liotta's performance is raw and grounded, carrying the story through sweat, exhaustion, and constant tension. The environment feels real because it was built physically, not digitally. Mud sticks. Rain weighs everything down. You feel the effort in every movement. Home viewing gave the film space to breathe. Without pressure to be a hit, it became something else entirely. A solid, gritty survival story from an era when mid-budget films were allowed to take risks. No Escape didn't vanish. It just waited for an audience willing to meet it on its own terms. Number 9. Miller's Crossing, 1990. Miller's Crossing had the worst possible timing. Released the same year as louder, faster crime films, it felt quiet by comparison. There were no flashy moments. No easy victories, just conversations loaded with threat and loyalty shifting one sentence at a time. Audiences weren't ready for that kind of patience. The box office reflected the mismatch. The film struggled, overshadowed by competitors that delivered instant impact instead of slow tension. At first glance, it looked like a miss, but Miller's Crossing ages like a novel. The dialogue is precise. Every pause matters. The performances are controlled to the point of discomfort. Even the opening image, a simple hat drifting through the woods, sets the tone for a story obsessed with control and consequence. Over time, writers and filmmakers began citing it as a masterclass in structure, not for action, but for power, for how influence works quietly, how decisions echo long after they're made. What once felt distant became endlessly rewatchable. This isn't a movie that demands attention. It earns it. And once audiences caught up to its rhythm, Miller's Crossing stopped being overlooked and started being respected. Number 8. Pump Up the Volume. 1990. Pump Up the Volume didn't fail because it lacked energy. It failed because it spoke directly to people studios didn't know how to reach yet. The story of a shy teenager turning into an anonymous voice of rebellion felt messy and unfocused to executives. The theatrical response was muted, but the movie found its real home somewhere else. On tapes passed between friends, on late-night cable, in bedrooms where people felt unheard. Christian Slater's performance crackles with urgency. Not polish, the film isn't about perfection, it's about release, about saying something because staying quiet feels worse. The radio broadcasts weren't slick, they were emotional, honest, sometimes reckless. As culture shifted, Pump Up the Volume started reading like a preview of online communities that didn't exist yet. Anonymous voices, shared frustration, finding connection through signals instead of faces. What once felt chaotic suddenly felt accurate. The movie didn't need box office success, it needed time. And once it reached the people it was actually made for, it became a defining cult experience, passed along, quoted, remembered. Number 7. Ravenous, 1999. Ravenous confused everyone. It looked like a historical thriller. It sounded like a survival story. But its tone kept slipping into dark humor and sharp commentary. Audiences didn't know how to react, and studios didn't know how to sell it. The result was a quiet collapse. The box office barely registered. The film disappeared almost immediately. What viewers later discovered was something far stranger and more confident. The performances are intense without being flashy. Robert Carlyle brings a restless unpredictability that makes every scene feel unstable. The score refuses to behave traditionally, adding to the sense that something is always off. Ravenous works because it commits fully to its odd identity. It doesn't explain itself. It doesn't apologize. It leans into discomfort and lets the atmosphere do the work. Over time, it gained a devoted following that appreciated its refusal to fit neatly into one category. It became a cult favorite, not because it was misunderstood, but because it never tried to be understood quickly. Number 6. Crash, 1996. Crash didn't just fail, it unsettled. The reaction was immediate and intense, with audiences unsure how to process what they were seeing. The film offered no comfort, no clear guidance, and no easy emotions. As a result, its theatrical life was brief and tense. But Crash was never designed for mass approval. David Cronenberg approached the material with restraint, not shock. The performances are calm, controlled, almost distant. That distance is the point. It forces viewers to confront ideas without being told how to feel. The film lingered long after screenings ended. Conversations followed. Debates grew. Over time, it found an audience willing to engage with its quiet provocation rather than reject it outright. Crash didn't become a cult classic through popularity. It became one through persistence. It stayed in the mind. It demanded revisiting. And eventually, it earned its place as one of the most challenging films of the decade. Number 5. Strange Days, 1995. Strange Days was supposed to be huge, a big-budget studio release with ambition, technology, and urgency baked into every frame. Instead, it landed with a thud. Audiences weren't ready for a future that felt this anxious, this overwhelming, and this personal. The marketing promised excitement. The film delivered immersion, and that disconnect cost it everything. The story drops viewers into a world drowning in recorded experiences. Memories can be replayed, emotions can be sold. Reality feels optional. At the center is Ralph Fiennes as a man clinging to the past while the world races forward without him. His performance is frantic and vulnerable, constantly chasing meaning in a system designed to drain it. The opening sequence alone was years ahead of its time, using extended first-person camera work that made viewers feel trapped inside someone else's panic. That intensity scared people away in theaters, but at home it became hypnotic. As media culture evolved, Strange Days stopped feeling exaggerated and started feeling accurate. surveillance, obsession, living through screens instead of moments. What once felt too much now feels familiar. The film didn't age quietly. It grew louder with time. Strange Days is no longer remembered as a studio misfire. It's remembered as a warning audiences didn't understand until it was already everywhere. Number 4. Lost Highway, 1997. Lost Highway didn't confuse audiences by accident. It challenged them on purpose. Released after its director had already tasted mainstream success, the film abandoned clarity completely. Identities shift, time bends, logic dissolves. Viewers expecting answers were met with silence. The box office response was swift and unforgiving. People walked out unsure of what they had seen, if they had seen anything at all. Critics were divided. The film seemed destined to remain an obscure misstep. Then midnight screenings changed everything. Freed from expectations, Lost Highway became an experience rather than a puzzle. Viewers stopped trying to solve it and started feeling it. The sound design hums with dread. The imagery sticks without explanation. Bill Pullman's performance fractures in ways that feel emotional rather than logical. The film gained power through repetition. Each viewing revealed new connections, not solutions. And that refusal to explain became its greatest strength. Lost Highway doesn't want understanding. It wants impact. Today, it's considered a cornerstone of psychological cinema. Proof that a movie doesn't need answers to leave a mark. Sometimes all it needs is the courage to stay unresolved. Number 3. Fallen Angels, 1995. Fallen Angels barely registered when it was released. Audiences didn't know what to do with its fractured structure, distorted visuals, and wandering characters. It wasn't a traditional story. It didn't hold your hand, and it certainly didn't explain itself. That confusion sent it straight past the box office. But Fallen Angels didn't disappear. It spread. Shot with extreme wide lenses that push faces toward the edge of the frame, the film turns the city into something warped and lonely. Neon lights smear across wet streets. Movement feels rushed and slowed at the same time. Characters drift instead of arrive. What once felt disorienting became influential. Music videos, fashion photography, street-level cinema. Entire visual languages borrowed from this film without audiences even realizing it. The characters feel isolated even when surrounded by people. That emotional distance became the film's signature. Fallen Angels doesn't ask you to follow a plot. It asks you to exist in a mood. Over time, it became less of a movie and more of a reference point. Not rediscovered, absorbed. Its cult status comes from influence, not nostalgia. And that kind of impact is impossible to fake. Number 2. Dark City, 1998. Dark City opened with mystery and closed before audiences could catch their breath. Released into a market hungry for fast-paced action, it delivered something slower, darker, and more philosophical. The studio even added narration to explain the story, afraid viewers wouldn't stick around long enough to understand it. They were probably right. The box office proved it. But Dark City was building something bigger than opening weekend numbers. A world where buildings shift, memories are rewritten, and identity is flexible. The city itself feels alive, rearranging reality every night without permission. The film's ideas echoed loudly just 1 year later in movies that would become global hits. Shared imagery, shared themes, shared questions about reality and control. Dark City simply got there first. Once audiences found it at home, the confusion turned into fascination. Without studio pressure, viewers could explore its layers at their own pace. The atmosphere, the philosophy, the quiet confidence of its design. Dark City didn't lose relevance. It gained it. And today it stands as one of the most influential science fiction films of the decade. Not because it succeeded, but because it dared to arrive early. Number 1. The Hudsucker Proxy, 1994. The Hudsucker Proxy was never meant to be subtle. It was loud, artificial, stylized, and completely out of step with what audiences expected in the mid-1990s. The studio spent big, the cast delivered big, and the box office collapsed just as dramatically. Viewers didn't know how to take a corporate satire that felt like a cartoon and a warning at the same time. The pacing was strange, the dialogue exaggerated, the world intentionally fake. At the time, it felt distancing. Now it feels precise. Tim Robbins plays a naive nobody lifted into power overnight, surrounded by smiling executives and quiet manipulation. Paul Newman anchors the film with charm masking decay. The story unfolds like a parable, exaggerating behavior until ambition itself looks absurd. What once seemed too broad now feels painfully accurate. The jokes land harder. The cynicism reads clearer. The artificial world mirrors systems that reward appearance over substance. The Hudsucker Proxy didn't fail because it lacked insight. It failed because it told the truth too playfully for its moment. Over time, it became one of its creator's sharpest statements. A cult classic built on timing, patience, and the slow realization that satire ages better than sincerity. So maybe box office numbers never told the full story. Maybe the movies that fell the hardest were the ones brave enough to take risks no one asked for. These films didn't beg for approval, they waited. And when audiences finally caught up, they hit harder than ever. Which one surprised you the most? Which deserved a second chance sooner? Drop your thoughts below, share this with a fellow movie lover, and subscribe for more stories hiding just beneath the surface of cinema history.